Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, let's discuss Roger Waters' The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. Released in 1984, this would be the first Roger Waters solo record. Some people think that this is a Roger Waters solo album. This was released in 1970, Music from the Body, but it's actually a Ron Geesin album. And Ron Geesin would go on to work with Pink Floyd on Adam Heart Mother with the orchestrations and the choir stuff on the title track. But Roger just kind of collaborates with Ron on this particular album. And this is an interesting record that will maybe get its own video at some point. And a lot of people consider the Final Cut to be the first Roger Waters solo album in a lot of ways, but that is under the name of Pink Floyd. And I did a In Defense video of the Final Cut that I will leave a link to in the description down below if you want to hear me discussing more of my thoughts on that specific album. I will say this, if you're not a fan of the Final Cut, and you haven't heard the pros and cons of Hitchhiking, you're probably not going to like the pros and cons. If you think the Final Cut is a slog and hard to get through, there's a lot of more of the same here on the pros and cons, but we're going to get into that as we go into the album more. Okay, so this album again was released a year after the Final Cut and a year before Roger would officially leave Pink Floyd. But this album goes back some ways. In 1978, Roger showed two ideas that he was working on to the other members of Pink Floyd. He showed them the pros and cons of hitchhiking, and he presented what was called at that time Bricks in the Wall, which would go on to be The Wall. Luckily, Pink Floyd decided to do The Wall because, as we all know, that was a huge, huge success. All right, so now, I mentioned the similarities between the pros and cons of Hitchhiking and the Final Cut, and I actually really like the Final Cut. I mentioned I did a video on it, link in the description. But for me, the pros and cons here, it misses the mark more than it hits it. And even though these two albums are very similar in their presentation, kind of the way the album moves and evolves, for me, the Final Cut resonates with me more because it's a little bit darker, it's a little bit moodier, there's stronger songs on it. Like, for instance, on the Final Cut, you have the title track, Not Now John, the Fletcher Memorial. There's a lot of really nice orchestrations and different sounds and stuff going on. And although you get that to a certain degree here on the pros and cons, for me, there's not enough excitement, there's not enough melodies on this. There's a lot of Roger's kind of half-spoken, half-singing type of thing. And although that works at times, it becomes a little bit too much as this album drags on. It's full of a lot of characteristic Pink Floyd things that you were hearing around the time of The Wall and the Final Cut. There's a lot of kind of sound effects, like traffic and car horns and sounds, ambient type of outdoor sounds going on in the background. There's even the guy that does the, if you can't eat your meat, if you don't eat your meat, can't have your pudding. That voice, you hear that a bunch of times here kind of in the background as this record goes along. But it's kind of a difficult record to get through. It's a concept album, and the storyline is a dream sequence which takes place between 4:30 a.m. and 5:11 a.m. right before the main character here wakes up. And what is interesting is the songs are listed as times, 4:30, 4:37, or whatever. And the times actually line up. If you start this record, if you were to start the record at 4:30 a.m., the times would all line up. And interestingly, Roger left about 5 seconds between the last song on side 1 and the first song on side 2 because he was anticipating people flipping the record or turning the cassette over. Of course, in the modern age of CD, this doesn't apply. But kind of interesting that it does follow the timeline. And next to every time, there is a title in parentheses given to each particular song. But the songs all segue and flow one into the other, and it's hard to tell at times when one song begins and another song ends. There's a lot of repetition of themes here, melodies that Roger sings, little guitar patterns that get played over and over again, and it just sort of starts to make everything start to sound the same, especially by the time you get to the second side. Now again, it's a concept record. It's hard to sort of follow along and understand what's really happening here, but it's loosely a guy who's facing a midlife crisis, goes on a road trip. He picks up a hitchhiker for sex along the way, and other stuff happens, and he's sort of contemplating life and his interactions with his wife and things like that. But it's all kind of confusing, and I find it hard to follow. There's a lot of guest musicians on this record, most notably Eric Clapton on guitar. And when I think about it, and you think about somebody who would be a good substitute, if you will, fill in, stand in for David Gilmour, the absence of David Gilmour, I think Eric Clapton is a good choice. They both have that similar guitar sound, a clean Strat guitar sound, very blues-based, very melodic. But what the album, in my opinion, really misses is David Gilmour, David Gilmour's voice, David Gilmour's songwriting. And although David Gilmour doesn't have a lot on the final cut, there are moments here and there, like Not Now, John, and stuff like that, where just having that little bit of variety with David there lifts the songs up, helps lift the albums up. I always say a perfect example of the dynamic between Roger and David is Comfortably Numb. The verses are totally Roger, dour, sour, down, minor key, and then there's that uplifting part, there is no pain, you know, and that's Dave, his contribution to that. And I think that those two always worked well together. When it's too much of Roger, it can be kind of a drag. You know, you miss sort of the more uplifting elements of David Gilmour. But Eric sounds great on this, and he actually plays a lot, which is kind of surprising considering the year that this came out. You know, Eric Clapton was doing his, I don't know what, soft rock, melodic radio pop rock, Lay Down Sally, stuff like that, where it didn't seem like he was doing a whole heck of a lot of playing compared to what he was doing in Cream. But on this record, he has a lot of nice guitar playing on it. And I was shocked that he even toured with the band for like the first half. I think it was in 1984, the first half of the tour. He was there for that. I just assumed he was just a guest musician. David Sanborn, the famous jazz saxophone player, he's also on here and has some really nice stuff. Actor Jack Palance, he makes an appearance as a Hell's Angel somewhere on the record. I can't find where that is. I don't recognize it, but just a little interesting tidbit thing. The album cover is done by Gerald Scarfe, who also did The Wall. And if you kind of look at the lettering on this, you can see that it is very sort of similar to the lettering on The Wall. This is a censored version of this. This apparently was a famous porn actress. Some versions don't have the censored version there, but all right. So in general, there's some good songs on here, but for me, there's just not enough variety. There's too much repetition. Side one moves along fairly well, but then it starts to get bogged down with repetitive musical themes and just there's not enough energy. It's like these songs, there's brief moments where the songs start kicking and getting moving, but they're so brief that you just wish that he could have kept that energy going. Instead, you know, it sort of lifts up just for 5-10 seconds, and then it drops back down into sort of this repetitive talking and speaking, sound effects and voices and stuff like that. And there's just not enough movement or energy, uplifting excitement on this record for me. Now Roger's lyrics are always great. I love there's a line in one of the songs where he says, "Did you understand the music, Yoko, or was it all in vain?" I think that's a great line. But again, it's hard to tell when one song ends, when another song begins. In the first song, you know, there's this great moment where Roger sings. He goes up in his range, and I love when Roger's up in his range and he's doing that sort of shouting thing. "So I stopped by the roadside, the soles of my running shoes gripping the tarmac like gunmetal magnets." That's just great, and it's like this great melody, and the guitar gets distorted there for a few seconds, but then it just drops back down again, and it just never stays there long enough with a lot of these things. There's another spot like that I really like. It's in the 4:41 a.m. Sexual Revolution song, and has this line, "I awoke in a fever, the bedclothes were all soaked in sweat. She said you've been having a nightmare and it's not over yet." And it's Roger up in his range there, and the music gets really exciting, but it just doesn't stay there long enough for me. And by the time we get to the second side, there's multiple times where it feels like the album should be ending. And I kept, I listened to it on vinyl, and I was also listening to it on streaming, and I would look at my phone like, oh, is it over? And it's like, oh man, there's still like another 10 minutes or 15 minutes on this record. So there's these moments where it lifts up, and then it sounds like a typical Roger Waters kind of coda ending type of thing, but then it just keeps going on and on. So maybe if the album had been edited a little bit more, some of these songs had been worked on more, it just might have flowed and worked a little bit better for me. It is fun that you hear some Floyd references here that made it onto the wall in the final cut. For instance, the melody from the Fletcher Memorial shows up in the song called "Go Fishing." You hear a little bit of the main wall theme at one point. Really, the only time that this album really lifts itself up and stays there for any length of time is on the title track, "The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking." And that one is great. It's got this cool beat to it. It's very melodic. The girl background singers, very catchy. I'm assuming I should have looked this up. I'm assuming that was the single off this record. And I have some memory of hearing that on the radio once or twice, and it makes sense. It's the only song on the record that from beginning to end, you get, 3.5 minutes of just consistent sort of energy and movement. So, okay, so for me, as much of a fan I am of Roger Waters, and the album is kind of fun. When I was listening to it on the vinyl as I was getting ready to make this video, it opened up a little bit more for me, and I was able to sort of appreciate some of the sound effects. The production, I forgot to mention, it's produced by, I don't know if I wrote it down somewhere here. It's produced by Roger and a guy that was involved plays the piano and the orchestration on the album. And it's very well recorded. It's very full. Michael Carmen is his name. He produces it with Roger. It's very, very well produced. You can tell they spent a lot of money on it. Very full, very warm. Tons of stuff going on, stereo effects, cars driving by, and things like that. But just for me, the songwriting, it just sort of misses the mark. It misses, you miss David Gilmour here. It's too much Roger. It's just a bit of a letdown for me. It's a bit of a bore. There's probably maybe 20 minutes worth of 20 minutes worth of exciting music on here. But in general, it just sort of misses the mark for me. So. All right, let me know what you guys think of the pros and cons of Hitchhiking. The album actually went on to go gold, which surprised me because I thought that the album was kind of a flop. But I think just because it was Roger so close to the final cut and the Pink Floyd name, he hadn't even left Pink Floyd yet. So probably just on the strength of him being a member of Pink Floyd at that point, it sold records. But the following tour from it was a disappointment. He put on this big, expensive, extravagant tour that, didn't sell as many tickets as they wanted it to, so that was a bit of a disappointment. But let me know what you guys think of Roger Waters and the pros and cons of Hitchhiking. Let me know in the description down below. And until we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.